you, Adrian. I'm Sarah Cooper. I'm the Associate Director of Democracy at the Carter Center. And I know we've sadly come to the end of our time together, but I'm delighted that we're going to be able to end this session on a very bright note. I'm personally honored to be sharing the stage with two women, Tanya to my immediate left and Chris down at the far end, who have been very long-time political and civic organizers in the state of Michigan. They both had very illustrious careers in state office and have now gone on to do so much civic organizing with so many different organizations. We probably could sit here for 10 minutes to list them all, but I will be giving them a bit of time to introduce themselves. And with Kevin Johnson, who is a longtime advocate for democratic institutions, both internationally and here in the United States. So I know that we're going to be learning a lot from these folks today. As Adrian mentioned, this panel really sits at the intersection of our principles of responsible oversight and trust. And we've heard a lot from our panelists throughout the day about how true trust and true change in the election space starts at a community level. And I'd actually like to reprise Tina's earlier point about how it's important to be the person with the experience, that you need to be part of the process rather than a part of the problem, and that really starts with grassroots organizing. We just heard from a few previous panelists who are doing fantastic work to mobilize average citizens, and all three of the individuals sharing the stage with me today are doing the same. They're the ones who are really, I think, going to be kind of the change makers looking into our upcoming election cycle. Before I turn it over to them, I also wanted to just note that this is kind of very central to the Carter Center's philosophy. We heard from Jason and from David earlier about our engagement in overseas elections to provide nonpartisan oversight of election processes. And it's really the same idea of providing trust through transparency, getting average citizens involved, whether it be as poll workers, partisan poll watchers, which we just heard about from Ellen, or as nonpartisan election observers who are really trained to look at the full process, to tell the story that Pam was talking about earlier. Were the problems big problems, small problems, problems that got resolved? And so we're very proud to be supporting some of that work, if I can just make a very small plug for us before turning over to our panelists in the states of Montana, New Mexico, and Georgia here at home for this election cycle. So we'd love to connect with anyone who wants to hear more about nonpartisan election observation after this event. But lots of organizations are getting involved to provide that responsible oversight, that credible information, provide civic education, make sure that citizens can then be part of the process, go back to their communities, and ensure that the outcomes of elections are trusted. So let me maybe turn to our three panelists now. I'll start with Tanya just to say a word about yourselves, and then I will have some questions for you so we can learn about your organizations.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tanya Shootmaker. My background, I'm a lifelong Michigander, Michiganian, maybe sometimes. I remember the first letter I got in the legislature was, it's not Michigander, it's Michiganian from an English teacher. So, but then our dear governor settled it once and for all, and it was Michigander. So, but some people, anyway, so I grew up on a small family farm. My dad was an attorney, and my mother was a social worker. Gave me a really appreciation. We had spirited dinner conversations. By background, my mother probably leans, as most social workers, a little to the left. My dad's a little to the right. So politics, and my parents were very involved in our community. So politics was always something that was discussed at our dinner table. Actually, my grandmother was a freedom rider. Fast forward, I became an attorney, practiced law for 10 years, and had my first race I lost. I ran for judge when I was a year out of law school. But in life, you learn more from your losses than you ever do your successes. And continued to stay involved in my community and give back. I think public service is just an admirable career, and I think you get a lot more out of public service just by the love that you get back and by doing a good job at your profession. So I ran for state house, then I ran for Senate. I served 6 years in the House, 8 years as Senate President Pro Tem. I was voted on by both sides of the party unanimously as President Pro Tem. It's sad to see that ceremonial thing has been unfortunately become very partisan. It should be just a formality to be voted on. But when I was there, I can say that I worked with both sides of the aisle, and we were all friends. We all worked together for 14 years. Just as I came in, you were saw the uptick of social media. So it's a whole new environment out there these days. And so people ask me all the time, do I miss serving? And I miss the people I worked with some incredible people on both sides. But the toxic environment is a little difficult, which is one of the reasons I decided to do the position I am.
Kevin.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm Kevin Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of Election Reformers Network. I'll say a bit more about what that organization is and what we do in a minute, but I just want to say that we kind of arise out of the experience of helping promote democracy overseas. And I was in that work for many, many years. And that gave me the opportunity to have that just amazing experience of working with President Carter overseas as he just gave his heart and soul for what this conference is about, principles of trusted election. So I just want to shout out to you at the Carter Center for what an incredible job you guys have done in taking that spirit forward, and also what great partners you've been to ERN.
Right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Gregg, and I am the left-leaning co-lead of Michiganders for Civic Resilience with Tanya. I grew up in rural Indiana, one of 12 kids. My parents taught us to all talk to each other and still hug it out at the end of the day. We're all very, very different. And then I lived in Chicago before I moved to Michigan about 35 years ago. And it wasn't until I was 50 years old that I decided to run for office. I had worked in the technology field for a long time, which is the reason why I'm always asking the questions about how technically does this work, when it comes to elections. And then anyway, I served 6 years in the State House. My last term was in the 19 and 20, so I was there for the 20 election when a lot of things were going on with doubts about the process, and it was just a real wake-up call for me that a lot of people just don't understand what our process is. And so when the opportunity came to serve at the Carter Center and help with promoting civil discourse and election information, education, I just had to jump at the chance, and very happy that I did.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all. For my first question, I wanted to ask Tanya and Chris. Earlier this year, you launched Michiganders for Civic Resilience. I was fortunate enough to be present. It was actually here in this same room. I wanted to ask both of you a little bit about what the organization does, how you're helping to promote trust in elections this election cycle, and why you chose to be involved.
Well, so the Michiganders for Civic Resilience, we launched in March. Chris and I did right here in this very room, and we also had a West Side launch. But it restores, brings people. We don't want to think all alike. That is not what our nation was built upon. The freedom of ideas. Out of that comes great public policy, in my opinion. And so we launched to bring people of different parts of the parties, whether you're right or left or somewhere in between, together for a couple of reasons. One, we don't want to see any political violence out of this next coming election, no matter who wins, whether it's Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. One side or the other is probably going to lose their minds, or at least maybe not the whole side, but maybe a contingent. And so we don't want to see that. So how do we tamp down on that? It's coming together from a grassroots point of view to really do that. We also believe that we need to have confidence in safe and secure elections, and people need to have confidence. One of the reasons I decided to get involved is actually I had a wonderful experience. I served on our board of canvassers probably 20 years ago for 2 or 3 years. And it really gave me a background about how our elections have built-in redundancies and how it's a math problem. So when Donald Trump last election, I actually was on the ballot. So I actually wanted to win. I found out, with that experience, I realized I didn't win, and that's fair and square. And you be a gracious loser. And so we need to educate our fellow Michiganders about the redundancies. And Chris and I just were fortunate to partner with Keep Our Republic and Lisa Posthumous-Lyons, who was the Kent County Clerk, to talk about the redundancies in elections and the checks and balances, and that we have paper ballots, that there is an air gap between that the machines are not connected to the internet. So the more we get out the word about our safe and secure elections, I think the more people will have faith and be secure that their vote was cast and that our elections are not stolen or rigged.
And I think in addition to those grassroots events that we're doing to connect directly, we're also building a network of people that we can activate and mobilize if something were to happen where we wanted to push out information. We had in the last election cycle here a case where there was a voicemail left all over about the election date was different, and it was really trying to suppress the vote for people and get them confused. And that's the idea. If something like that happens, we can activate this network to push out the correct information, working with elected officials or other organizations too. So it's kind of a top-down and bottom-up approach all at the same time.
Fantastic. And if I could just ask a follow-on question about this, I understand that the two of you are just coming off a tour from around the north of the state, where you talked about trust in elections. You heard from community members about what some of their misconceptions might be. What are some of the things that you learned that you think might influence your work going forward?
Sure. It was really interesting. So we did 5 events in the northern part of the Lower Peninsula and then the Upper Peninsula too. So quite a 1,000 miles, right, Julia? Isn't that what you put on your car? And we had our last 2 in particular, we had just a really great turnout and a lot of questions. We had this local radio guy, Trucker Randy is his name, and he's able to reach out to, I would say, more the right-leaning citizens up there and got them to come to our event, which was really good because it was a little bit of a struggle, some of the earlier ones. But I'd say most of the questions where we had a more robust audience was around the technology and really truly understanding that in our decentralized system here in Michigan, those tabulators are independent machines, right? And it's through the memory cards that you take out of it and that you process. And then we have paper backup for everything, and that we have 3 copies of everything. And so just walking them through that process, especially with a county clerk who actually does the work, was really, really helpful. So I think we are able to dispel some of those. And some other things were just like the registration process to vote. We had, as a lot of states did back in 2020, a lot of controversy about mailing out applications for absentee ballots. So we walked through that process. It's like, I'll use our line, right? It's like you might get 10 credit card applications in your mail, right? Doesn't mean you have the credit card. And so, we walked through that, and I think that was helpful as well.
Fantastic. And I know we appreciated hearing earlier today from Tina and from Justin about some of these election processes. And if folks have additional questions, I'm sure they would love to be resources continuing even after the event. Let me turn now to Kevin. You mentioned your extensive comparative experience in international and national democracy support, and I know you launched the Election Reformers Network in part to shine a light on some of the ways that America's institutions are both outliers and potentially models for other countries. We heard from Heather earlier this afternoon about the Election Overtime Project, but could you maybe elaborate a little bit on some of the ways that you're working with the Carter Center and others, and to emphasize the importance of institutions in close and contested elections?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. On that international piece, building institutions is really complicated. And countries learn from each other about how to improve and what the innovations are. What are good ideas about building institutions? They do that in every sector, and we should do that in democracy too. There are things that are happening in other countries that we can learn from, and vice versa. Just a very quick example, we did a study just the other day looking at certification, obviously a very hot topic now, and how it's done in 12 peer democracies. And is there something like our phase where the election officials do their work and then hand their results effectively to kind of a political body or a board? None of the 12 countries that we looked at had that. In fact, we couldn't even find the word certification in their election law. Instead, the election officials announce the result, and then the results go to a court where there are hearings, discussion, and the judges make the final decision. So learning about that, it's not as though that's implementable any day, right away, but it does feed our sort of knowledge of how important the courts are. And courts play a role, an established role in election law in every single state. It doesn't get talked about enough. But courts are the institution that are institutionally the best institution available in our system to hear evidence, weigh evidence in a rational way, and render decisions. And so that the international aspect has, led us to emphasize that. So that's just an example of how that piece, functions in our process. To your question of stuff that we're doing, I think Heather nailed it in describing the election overtime project. And she does just about everything perfectly except using sports metaphors appropriately. So I have to jump in and fill in the sports metaphor. And of course, the sports metaphor is kind of obvious. Sports fans, when the game is very close, even if it's decided in overtime, fans know the rules of overtime and they leave without any dispute about who won. That's what we want to translate to voters as well. And so election overtime is basically about getting enough knowledge of the rules so everyone knows it's clear. It's as clear as that scoreboard when the buzzer ends, who won and who lost. Obviously, it's not quite that simple, but that's the aspiration that we want to trek toward.
You might have a toe on the end line.
Yeah, well, but we can go to the video review judge, right? And every sports fan knows that if there needs to be enough evidence to overturn the ruling on the field, right? So you have a sense of what's the evidentiary standard. You have to be able to overturn it. So even that the fans know, and so we need that same level of
I
understanding.
think the Olympics were probably a pretty good example too, right? With having to certify and go back and look. and
Right.
It's a process. It's not, you don't know as soon as the game's over.
Rule of law, rule of sports. Yeah.
Well, you all sound like sports ball experts to me. I'm probably in Heather's camp. But this is actually a great transition. We started off this convening yesterday talking about the importance of a peaceful transfer of power for our democracy. This obviously relies on having acceptance of the announced results. Kevin, you were just saying that we don't kind of talk enough about that legal backstop that Jason was mentioning earlier, the potential role of the courts in post-election dispute resolution processes. So what are kind of some of the important steps of the process that you think it's important for folks to know about and that we should be talking about a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of this was covered earlier, but audits and recounts are really important redundancy features, and they operate differently in different states, but in most states, candidates have the right to request a recount, or there are mechanisms by which a recount can be automatically triggered if the margin is below. And a recount just means, reprocessing the original feeding of the ballots through the tabulator. It's not a hand count. And then audits are also a very important function. That's more of a statistical mechanism where a sample size of ballots will be pulled out, a representative sample of ballots will be pulled out and counted, and that hand count will be compared. Does it name the same winner as the official results from? And these all can have the potential to catch a glitch or if something unexpected happened. In the history of recounts and audits, it's almost never happened that an actual outcome has been changed. It's gone from candidate A to candidate B who wins. The numbers might change a little bit, but just that fact that our system is so reliable that recounts and audits almost never change the outcome, or the winner is itself a reason for confidence. So those are good and those are important. But I also want to talk a little bit further about the court process. And every state gives the right to campaigns and candidates to challenge the results in court. Usually that challenge period is after the results have been certified, so the challenge is to the certified results. And this is the opportunity to present evidence in court that maybe something happened. And of course, things can happen, right? It's human institutions, all the flaws can happen. There are principles that guide how courts handle those cases. There are principles that effectively are similar to innocent until proven guilty, right? We would never want someone to be sentenced for murder out of the theory that maybe they could have been in the room when the gun was there and they could have pulled the trigger. Every citizen would repeal in horror at that degree of kind of speculativeness. We haven't translated that effectively into elections where there's a lot of talk about, well, there could have been a connection to the internet, or there are non-citizens here and maybe they could have voted. And so the launching of the speculation is sort of done in a way that just the fact that it could have happened is sufficient. And so this is part of the reason why courts are so important, is that they provide the evidentiary standard that really can keep allegations from gaining traction if there's no way that they can actually surpass that innocent until proven guilty kind of threshold. The other principle to think about that's important with courts, and this came up earlier, is lots of mistakes can happen that are immaterial relative to the margin of victory. And so if you're challenging, it's an 1,000 vote difference, and you've got questions about 100 votes, that's irrelevant to the outcome. So these kinds of principles are important. So just bigger picture, the right of candidates and parties to challenge, to bring these cases to court is fundamental. And, when President Carter was overseas observing elections, it would be one of the first things that he would go and look for. And it wasn't always all that well upheld here in the United States. Decades ago, federal precedent was a little bit weak on this. And there was the principle that, well, elections are political, the federal courts shouldn't really get involved. And frankly, many decades ago, a decent number of fraudulent elections were allowed to stand that should have been overthrown if we had the courts doing the role that they should. Now they do. We have that right. But our kind of political conversation hasn't caught up enough about it. And so we don't talk about it enough. And the media doesn't talk about it enough. And in 2020, there were 64 challenges by the Trump campaign about the results, about the process. The result of that competition was 63-1, which to me should have been the scoreboard that the whole country could have seen. And to our panel that Heather ran on media, really wasn't promoted as much as it should have been. There was much more of a tendency to quote an alleged expert on the elections and how great they were, rather than quoting the decisions of the court, which really is the last word when you think about it from a rule of law perspective.
And I think from our perspective too, reaching the general public and instilling that trust in results is to journey with them on the process of an election. So many times, as soon as the polls are closed, I think that's it, we're done, I've got my answer. That's just the beginning of the process. We still have 6 days where we might get military and overseas ballots. We have obviously the certification process. And so I think a lot of times we haven't necessarily focused on keeping voters abreast of where we are in the process. So there's a gap when they close the polls and then where they're announced after certification, but all that in between is just a lot of time where people can send up stories and, conspiracy theories and all of this. But if we're more engaged in that gap before certification, I think that also will help and really build trust in the results.
Fantastic. Well, you started to answer my next question, but I'm going to go ahead and pose it back to the panel and just see if there's anything that you would like to elaborate on. Kind of going back to that gap that Kevin mentioned between our procedures that have become very strong and what the public knows and what the media is sharing. From your different vantage points, are the three of you seeing any efforts that you think are particularly effective to educate the public about these post-election procedures? And where do you think there's kind of room for future improvements or for further work?
Well, what's great is there's so many organizations that are in this space. Since we've gotten in this, Michiganders for Civic Resilience, we have partnered with, and we're all trying to accomplish the same thing. So there's no competition. But Braver Angels, Keep Our Republic, there's Kevin's organization, there's another couple of other ones out there. And so that's a great thing. I think at least Michiganders for Civic Resilience, we're focused on the grassroots. So going all over the state, that's what led us up to the UP, because they need to be, they're part of our wonderful, great state. They often feel left out. And so the more we get out this word, we had events over in Farmington, we're having them on the west side, the better off we are.
And I think too, one of the things that came out of our trip up north is really emphasizing to the public just how transparent this process is before and after the election, and really encouraging people to participate in that. Go to the logic and accuracy tests events that are happening. Go to a polling location, just check it out, volunteer. And the more we can get them aware that it is very open and transparent, the better. And I think the elected officials we've worked with too are doing all they can to really emphasize that as well and bring the public into the process more.
I just echo that last point. I mean, a lot of surveys show how trusted election officials are. They are recognizing the power and the potential that they have in that. And they're also recognizing that, unfortunately, they have to kind of have a PR approach to elections. They can't just be technocrats. And so many of them are stepping into that role. And as we've heard many times, inviting people in so they can go through and showcase the whole process and see how it all works. And I think that's had a really great impact. They've had a lot of support from good organizations. Tina, your group, and the elections group, and all the work that you guys have done, and others to enable them to do that and to help train them to do that has been really powerful. So all of that is really, I think, having a big effect.
Yeah, our clerks are unsung heroes.
Absolutely. Yep. Round of applause. I agree,
And
Tina.
I would also agree with the poll workers that work for the clerks, and then also the board of canvassers too. They really are unsung heroes, and that's one of the reasons to see my sweet, wonderful clerk get beat on by her own party, and that's one of the reasons I did. Also, personal stories of Bill Gates from Arizona, not the Microsoft guy, but to see what he went through just by being a member of the board of canvassers is just really should not happen here in our wonderful country.
I've seen some other things too, where like the League of Women Voters, are really stepping up their efforts to do training of the broader public, and they've invited us to come and speak at some of their meetings. We also have civility projects going on all across the state too, and I think that indirectly feeds into this as well. And just having a curiosity about your fellow Americans as well as the processes themselves, and it's really really actually encouraging to see all the activities that are going on now.
Fantastic. I want to go back to the point, Kevin, that you made about parties having the opportunity to challenge results in court if they so desire. And I actually wanted to pose a question to Chris and Tanya, because you've both campaigned for office in the state of Michigan. One of the things that I think does provide kind of a further check and more transparency in the system is that political parties can have their watchers present. They can observe the process. They do have the ability to raise challenges after the election process is concluded if they have concerns. Have the two of you ever engaged with poll watching efforts as candidates in the state of Michigan, and how did that kind of affect your campaign?
As candidates, as a candidate, I actually did not really pay that much attention. I got to election day and I'm like, okay, I plan to sleep in that day, because your work's kind of done by election day. Either you've won or lost. You're not going to really change the effect by the next 8 hours. I mean, I guess I did sign waving on the street corners, but when I ran, the last time I stood for election was 2014. There was still faith in the election process. Nobody questioned the election process. When I will say, and we're all a little disheartened that we're so polarized, but I'd rather take where we are now than when I first ran for office back in 2004. And the most question I got from people was, we don't have less than 50% of people are voting. How do we get people civically engaged? So yeah, we've gone up to, close to 70s. You probably know the exact numbers, over 70% of people voting. That's a great thing. And so, I'd rather take where we are over 70% of people voting than where we were below 50%.
I didn't, I was fortunate as well too. The last time I ran, at the polls themselves didn't have a lot of issues with that. I think everything ran pretty smoothly. What I'm seeing today is the local party clubs really stepping up and recruiting for precinct delegates, because we had a huge gap. I think we still do on just filling those for precinct delegates. And then that led to recruiting for challengers too, and getting credentialed through the Democratic Party. And I've seen a lot of my friends who were not involved at all in elections step up and do this work, and have had really positive experiences. And then they talk about it as well. So I think the local and the county party organizations are doing a really good job recruiting more people to be involved. And I really like our system in the state where, there are rules to being a challenger. You have certain, you have to be credentialed, and there's only a certain kind of organizations that can be the credentialer. And so I just think it's a really good system where you can have all those challengers there, but there's a process to go through to make sure that they know the rules of the road of serving in that position.
I would just echo that. I mean, Ellen very eloquently said, if you're complaining and you're not in the game, zip it. I mean, you should if you have concerns, you can address those concerns by getting in the game. And I mentioned that in reference to your question, because that's what party poll watching is all about. That, if you're doubtful about a process, you've got the opportunity to have your agents there who can watch everything and record everything. And then if something went on, you've got the evidence. And if something didn't, zip it. Just to get, that's going to be the quote, I think, here. But it does, I mean, it's important to think of, no system works all that well if it's all sort of one source of information. And as trusted as election officials are, and as trustworthy as their processes are, it's not really going to work for us to have an approach that says, trust them. You know why? Because everything they do is trustworthy. Instead, we need a system where they're explaining what they're doing, other people are watching them and saying what they're seeing, and other people are challenging them in court, and where judges are ruling on. So there's three different sources of communication that citizens and competitors can all say, wow, all three of those are pointing to the same conclusion. This is not just one side making a declaration. This is a process that gets at the truth from multiple sides, so it must be true.
I think that's a very important point, and just to take it back to our principle around trusted outcomes and the way that it's been framed, I think just very important to stress that once you've kind of gone through that process of getting the information, once you've gone and kind of taken things to the courts, just how important it is to accept what the outcome is there, that you can go through the legal process, play by the rule of law, and at the end of the day, the results are the results. And it's very important to have the humility to concede if that's what it comes down to.
Can I actually read the principle on that? Because
Please.
I think it's, with one of the last principle in the 5 principles of the principles for trusted election is make claims of election irregularities in accordance with the law and acknowledge the legitimacy of the outcomes after the results have been certified and all contestations decided. Everyone get that? It's pretty complicated. I kind of wanted to read it, partly because this is a conference about those principles, and it's an important principle. But I also wanted to read it because it gets at one of our challenges, which is the complexity of the system. Heather and I were trying to write a one-sentence framing of when presidential election results are final. Is it when they're certified when the governor issues the certificate of ascertainment? No, actually, because those are subject to change if there's a court ruling that overturns the result. Is it when the electors have voted? We hope so, but there are certain situations when those can be challenged. Very, very narrow situations when the results can be challenged in Congress. So this is sort of a bigger project in a sense. But again, from a comparative perspective, finality is clearer in the election codes of most of our peer democracies. We have a system that makes finality hard to say, and that gets reflected in, we work together on this language. I think I drafted some of the complexity of that principle, but it's the way you had to say it to be legally accurate. So this again goes to the overtime project. We need to explain these complicated things, and we can trust people can handle them, because people can handle the difference between the way overtime works in college football and the way overtime works in pro football. They get these complications and they care, so they're going to get this too. So.
Great. Well, I have one last question for the panel, but I'm going to hold it. For any of the sports fans out there, do any of you have questions that you'd like to pose to our 3 panelists about the post-election dispute resolution process or about the work that they're doing? Yes, please, sir.
Hi.
Someone's coming around with a microphone.
Thanks, Roger Kirsten. I'm a journalist here in Michigan. I cover politics for Slate, Salon, Washington Monthly, and other publications. It's a great time to be a freelancer in a swing state, I got to tell you. I don't know if this is allowed, but this is a question going back to something that came up on a previous panel. We shared this interview with Adam Kinzinger, who said, well, if the voters choose the Democrats, but the legislature chooses the Republican, it goes to Congress, we're stuck with it, and that was all wrong. Well, forgive my ignorance, but why is that wrong? How does it really work?
Yeah, very good question. What Kinzinger got wrong is he said that the Arizona legislature has responsibility for certifying the results in the state. That's not right. It's the Secretary of State who has responsibility for certifying. There is no state in the country where the legislature certifies presidential results.
But people think that power exists, right? That's one of the theories floating around.
Yeah, and again, a lot of the narrative going around in 2020 was that legislatures had a certain power to kind of act after an election, Congress did a really good job in addressing that. And so a big picture message about the elections is our institutions held in 2020 and they've been strengthened. And one of the main ways they've been strengthened is by the Electoral Count Reform Act. And one of the key provisions in the Electoral Count Reform Act is that states can't change their laws after an election. That was probably true in law before, but it wasn't certain. Now it's absolutely certain. And because of the possibility that maybe it was true, we had all of these kind of conspiracy attempts. Let's get let's get the Arizona legislature to call a special session and issue its own set of electors. That was always legally dubious, but at least it had enough credibility that people were trying to advance those ideas. Now it's absolutely certain that that's not allowed.
Yeah, and I think in Michigan too, it was like, and do an end round around the governor too. It was just the legislature, because again, back in 2020, it was a Republican-controlled state house, democratically controlled governor, and that was the theory that was going around, is because, elections are left to the states and the state legislatures make all these. They must be able to do it. It was after we actually confirmed our electors that I kind of first breathed a sigh of relief in 2020, but that still wasn't the end though, was it?
That's right.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, going off what Chris just said, I think part of the confusion comes from Article 2, Section 1, where it says that the electoral vote is determined in a manner determined by the state legislatures, who deputize the executive branch, then the Secretary of State and the executive branch, to actually certify the vote.
My understanding of that is that article refers. Oh, sorry, that article refers to the way in which the state decides to select its electors. The government, the legislator can appoint them. That's what used to happen early in American history. They can have a popular election. That's what all states do now. So that's the legislature has the right to decide the voting mechanism.
Correct.
And so once and ECRA says, once they've decided that voting mechanism, they can't change that decision.
That's correct. Yeah. So what they do is the state legislature just determines the method, and then that goes into place once the election is done. And like in Florida in 2000, right, they had created the system where it goes to the Secretary of State, and then the Florida State Supreme Court, steps in and demands a recount. So then it became the big thing between the Secretary of State's office and the Florida court.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Any other questions for the panel? They can be more general. We don't have to go super technical. Yeah, please.
Thank you, guys. This has been really, really enlightening. And I am sort of horrified at how much I learned from observing other countries' election processes, and how much I didn't know about our own, and how much I continue to learn about our system, which is pretty pathetic. But I wanted to ask a question that I have been sort of thinking about in my head a lot. If the ballot box is on January 6th had not been smartly grabbed before they ran out of the House, what would have happened? I mean, so we've talked about ballot security having a sort of second set of eyes by the actual hand counts. But is there anything like the designated survivor that we have for,
there
the
is.
actual? Okay, great. Thank you.
So the electors are instructed to fill out the result of their vote, send that to the 6 copies, I think. Someone might know the law. 6 copies to the archivist of the United States, and then send a copy to the Senate. But certainly there's 6 backup copies that go to the archivist. So there is a backup if anything happens to that funny looking wooden.
And I might just add on the county and the local levels, it's the same. You have duplicate copies. Am I right, Justin? Duplicate copies of the election results.
As soon as immediately after the vote, the electors vote on day 42 after the election, and then they have these forms that they send, and I think that used to be they had to be sent by mail. I think they now can be sent by the most expeditious means, I think is in the law. So they arrive in that's December. What date is that in December this year? December 14th, I think, something like that. The other thing to say on this topic that I don't think gets known enough is that, I mean, we use the language of certification in Congress, that Congress certifies the presidential results. There are a lot of legal scholars who say that is really the wrong word to use. They count, and they do not have the right to judge each vote. They can object, but on extremely narrow grounds. The law says they can object to an electoral vote that is not regularly given, meaning not given in according to the regulations. Those regulations are that the president has to be 35 years or older. The president and the vice president have to be from different states. So the only ground, or if the certificate from the state if the results have not been properly certified according to state law. So if that state certificate of ascertainment hasn't been done correctly, there's a potential for an objection. But otherwise, the only objection they could raise is, that candidate isn't over 35. Of course, no party is going to have a candidate that isn't constitutionally eligible. So the whole country, in a way, needs to back down on its thinking about what Congress does. And we need journalists to stop this kind of gotcha question. Are you going to certify the result? Which is a little bit about clickbait, frankly, and it's not really a real understanding of kind of the way things work.
They have been held in contempt for voting no.
That depends on how you interpret the Electoral Count Act from 1887, because they were operating under the old law, and I think it was ambiguous enough. It's a little bit hard to say, but and there were some people who wanted to see ECRA have that 1 degree more teeth, be more toothsome, and actually specify what action would be taken if Congress did try to stop the voting. And Larry Lessig has been arguing this, that there could still be a problem because Congress might not actually abide by ECRA. And then what happens then? Sort of want to have the Supreme Court in the room, I think would have been a nice thing to include in that law. So that if there are questions about what is a valid objection or not, you can go directly to the source and they can, I don't know. We're getting into really arcane here. But yeah.
I'm sensing perhaps a podcast between Ambassador Page and Kevin in the future. But we do only have a minute left, and so I do want to take the moderator's privilege just to pose a final question to our panelists. I learned today that the great divide in the state is not Democrat or Republican, but Michigander. Is there a final message that you'd like to leave your fellow Michiganders, Michiganians, with about ways that they can engage with your work going into the election?
Excellent question. And Chris always gets me because she's like, you didn't urge people to join our organization. So I am going to urge you. There's a QR code over there. We've got materials back there. Also, if you Google Michiganders for Civic Resilience, we need part of a big team. We need Republicans, independents, and Democrats and everything else out there to be part of it so that we can have confidence and foster a relation or an organization that can get out the message, can restore civil discourse, and mitigate any political violence.
And we're on social media, Facebook, X, and
Yes.
Instagram, right?
Yes.
And LinkedIn.
This is why we make a good team.
And check out electionovertime.org for more information about that project. Check out electionreformers.org for the other work we're doing in election governance. And come and watch a virtual news briefing that we're going to hold in Michigan, where we're going to be super honored to share the stage with the Michiganders, Michigians, whatever they are, from Civic Resilience, along with folks from the Carter Center and the Ford Foundation, I believe. So that'll be in early October, October 3rd or 4th, I think. I'm looking at Heather. Or is it the week after? Yeah, it's the following week, the week of October 7th. Thank you.
Great. Well, can we have a huge round of applause for our panelists for covering elections from top to bottom? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah, Tanya, Kevin, and Chris. Sarah, I'm going to ask you to stay right there. We're going to have Jeff Pollitt from the Ford Presidential Foundation and Jordan Brooks from More Perfect come up and close out the event with some remarks.
Need to turn this back on. Well, first of all, to our small but mighty audience, just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time over the last 2 days to engage with these topics on behalf of the Carter Center, as well as our colleagues at More Perfect, the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. Also want to give a shout out to Team Democracy and to Michiganders for Civic Resilience for supporting this event. These are clearly meaty, or perhaps toothy, I think was the word that was used, topics. We've had 2 very long days of very fulsome discussions, but this has given me a lot of hope looking into the future for the elections, that we can really engage across all levels of our society to promote trust and confidence in our elections. And it's just really been an honor and a privilege for us to have all of you here today to discuss these topics with us, and last night for those of you who were able to make the armchair conversation.
Hi, everybody. I think, it's just been really, really great to hear across the day, particularly today, how much more connects us than divides us. I think that's a big theme that we've seen across the day, and a big theme at More Perfect. And I know with our partners at Carter and Ford, how much we see on a day-to-day basis with all of the people we work with, all of the organizations we work with, all of the coalitions that we are building. And I think the lesson that continues to be drilled into my head every day is the more that we can actually have real conversations with each other about the fact, like I was chatting with a bunch of people about the fact that I'm 7 months pregnant, and that makes me, an interesting thing to talk about that is not about elections. But the more we have actual real conversations with each other about our humanness, it actually helps us to get back to thinking about our trust in democracy and how we can trust each other in order to then trust our country again, which I think is what we are at More Perfect are really trying to do with all of our partnerships and across a really great bipartisan coalition that we hope you all, for those of you who aren't already a part of it, will already come to join us with. And we're just so grateful to our partners at the Ford and Carter Centers who are diving in with us on all of this great work between now, particularly and the 250th anniversary of our country and beyond. So really looking forward to continuing a dialogue with all of you and continuing this conversation. So thank you all for being here and being a part of it.
Well, while you're looking forward, I'm going to look backward a second. We're obviously in a difficult election cycle right now. We've had, I'm thinking about 3 elections in particular, the election of 2000, which was a deeply contested election that clearly had flaws and errors that took place in the election process. And I remember at the time thinking that this could go sideways pretty quickly, but the rule of law prevailed. I think not everybody thinks it prevailed in exactly the same way, but it was resolved peaceably. And the transfer of power occurred peaceably. In the election of 1800, probably the most contentious election in our nation's history, it goes to 37 ballots in the House of Representatives before it's finally resolved, just a couple of weeks before Election Day. There's an interesting letter from Thomas Jefferson to James Monroe that he writes in the middle of February. Inauguration Day was, did I say Election Day earlier? Inauguration Day. Inauguration Day was March 4th back then. In the middle of February, Jefferson writes a letter to James Monroe, ordering Monroe to seize all the armaments in the Federal Armory in Richmond, because he thinks that the Federalists are stealing the election from him. Another moment where this country came very close to a violent resolution at a very early point, vulnerable point in its history. The third election is the election of 1860. After Lincoln is elected, southern states begin seceding prior to the inauguration on March 4th. And Lincoln gives his inauguration day speech. And it's a very long speech, unlike his second inaugural address, which is very brief. It's a very long, detailed, complex speech. And he gets to the end of it and says, "I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break the bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory, stretching across every battlefield and patriot grave, through every living heart and hearthstone across this broad land, will yet swell again with the chorus of union when touched by the better angels of our nature. So I think the better angels of our nature are still there. I think it's something that we're still hopeful for. And I think events like this, hopefully all of you go out and start telling people about it. People start watching the videos of this online. And we touch once again the better angels of our nature. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you to everyone at Carter and More Perfect and Team Democracy and Michiganders for Civic Resilience for all your help and support. And lest I forget, there is all kinds of promotional material on the back table there about principles for trusted elections and other initiatives that have been talked about today. Please take some of that promotional material with you. Thank you.